Elara swallowed the bitter chalk of poison, chasing it down with a mouthful of copper-tasting saliva. Scrubbing the sticky counter with a frayed rag, her hands shook violently against the laminate. The suppressants were rotting her out from the inside, packing her veins with what felt like crushed glass. But the daily agony beat the alternative. Alpha Vance ran breeding camps for local Omegas, making absolute invisibility her only shot at keeping her freedom. The rusted bell above the door chimed. Stale grease abruptly gave way to the suffocating stench of wet fur and pure malice. Boot heels cracked against the linoleum as two of Vance's enforcers stalked inside, rain rolling off their leather jackets in greasy drops. Both men lifted their chins, pulling jagged breaths through their teeth as they tasted the air. Tightening her grip on the rag, Elara dug her knuckles into the counter. Her dormant wolf clawed frantically at the cage of her ribs, begging to run, begging to fight, but she forced her shoulders to slump. Keep your head down. Scrub the stains. Stay human. Hey, old man, the taller enforcer barked, his voice rattling the cheap booths. You hiding any strays in the back? No, sir. Just me and the waitress. Nobody else. Leather creaked as the bigger brute pivoted, locking flat eyes on Elara's bent neck. Floorboards groaned under his weight as he closed the distance, stopping so close she could feel the damp cold rolling off his coat. He leaned over her shoulder, sucking in a rattling drag of air right next to her ear. Dust motes danced in the fluorescent light while she froze, staring blankly at the bleach-stained laminate, praying the chemical burns on her skin buried the scent of her royal bloodline. Smells like cheap bleach and garbage, the enforcer sneered, driving a brutal shove into her collarbone. Get me a coffee. Black. Right away. Fumbling for the glass pot, she poured the scalding liquid with vibrating fingers and pushed the mug across the counter. Laughter erupted from the men, loud and sharp, as they turned their backs on her. Agony stretched the next hour into an eternity of clinking silverware and muttered threats, until the door finally slammed shut behind them. Silence crashed over the empty diner. Elara grabbed a plastic bag from the kitchen bin, shoved the back door open, and practically fell into the freezing alley. Icy rain lashed her pale skin, whipping wet strands of hair across her eyes as she dragged her boots across the cracked asphalt. She hurled the bag into the iron dumpster, gripping the metal rim just to keep herself upright. A wet gasp ripped through the quiet rhythm of the storm. Dropping into a crouch, Elara squinted through the dancing shadows near the brick wall. A shape slumped against the stone, bleeding so much the sharp tang of hot copper completely overpowered the smell of wet trash. As the figure shifted, she realized it was a man, large enough to dwarf the surrounding garbage, bleeding out on the wet concrete. The memory of her family dying in the cold flashed behind her eyes, forcing her boots to move forward into the dark. Closing the final few feet between the dumpster and the bleeding stranger, Elara let the icy rain soak through her thin uniform, bracing herself for whatever monster had been ripped to shreds. The man lifted his head, pinning her in place with golden eyes that cut violently through the dark alley. Slashed across his broad chest, brutal marks poured hot blood down his ribs and into the dirty water surrounding his boots. Her inner wolf whined, scraping against her skull, urging her to run from the predatory heat rolling off him. Reaching into her apron instead, her fingers brushed against the wrapped half of a sandwich she had hoarded for dinner. Starvation was a grinding ache she knew intimately, and she couldn't leave another soul to rot in the cold. Here, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the downpour. His chest heaved, tracking the wrapped bread before dragging those golden eyes back up to her face. A rumbling growl vibrated deep in his throat, carrying no threat, only the jagged edge of absolute agony. Dropping to her knees in the filthy puddles, she peeled the plastic back and pushed the food closer to his mouth. Eat it. You need your strength. Water slapped against the concrete as his blood-stained hand shot out, completely ignoring the meal. Thick fingers locked around her wrist, burning like iron straight through her freezing skin. The steady drone of the rain, muted into a distant hum. Dragging her arm closer to his mouth, he hovered his nose directly over her pulse point and took a desperate drag of air. Terror spiked her heart rate, flooding her mind with the certainty that he would smell the Omega cowering beneath the suppressants. Instead of snarling, the brutal lines of his face relaxed into an expression of violent wonder. "Mine," he rasped, grinding the word out like broken glass. Ripping her arm back, Elara shoved the crushed sandwich into his open palm and scrambled backward across the wet asphalt. She yanked a clean rag from her pocket, throwing it at his ruined chest. He groaned, letting his head crack back against the brick wall. "Hold that there," she ordered, scrambling to her feet as her voice cracked. "Don't move. I have to go back inside." Spinning on her heel, she bolted for the rusted door, slamming it shut behind her and driving the deadbolt home. Sliding down the steel frame, she pulled her knees to her chest while the skin on her wrist burned from his touch. Hours dragged by until her shift ended and the storm finally broke, leaving the alley completely silent. Pushing the door open, she found only a washed-out stain on the concrete and her dirty rag sitting neatly on the dumpster lid. The monster had vanished into the night. 3 agonizing weeks ground by, turning the memory of the golden-eyed stranger into a fever dream, lost amidst the daily grind of staying alive. Hiding in the cramped bathroom, Elara stared at the cracked mirror, watching beads of sweat track through the dark bruises under her eyes. Her supplier had been arrested 3 days ago, leaving her to ride out the terrifying withdrawal as the final dose of suppressants finally cleared her veins. Without the chemical cage, her wolf paced relentlessly inside her skull, clawing at the mental walls. Her floral scent leaked through her pores, entirely overpowering the cheap bleach and stale coffee clinging to her uniform. If a stray wolf walked in today, they wouldn't just smell a rogue, they would smell royal blood, and Alpha Vance would torture her for sport. "Elara!" The owner barked through the thin door, rattling the hinges. "Table 4 needs clearing." "Coming." Twisting the rusted faucet, she splashed freezing water onto her flushed cheeks and forced herself to walk out into the deafening rush. Clattering plates and shouting customers assaulted her ringing ears while she stacked ceramic cups onto a plastic tray. Then, the bell above the door chimed. The din of the restaurant vanished, swallowed instantly by a crushing pressure that forced the oxygen straight out of Elara's lungs. It was an alpha command, but it felt like a concrete slab dropping directly onto her shoulders. Gripping the edges of her tray, she watched the front doors blow open so violently the metal hinges snapped and rained screws onto the floorboards. A towering man stepped through the threshold, wearing a tailored suit stretched tight over coiled muscle. Scars snaked past the collar of his expensive shirt, leading up to a face she knew intimately, framed by swept-back hair and terrifying golden eyes. The dying man from the alley hadn't just survived. He stood there, radiating dictatorial ruin, not just an alpha, but a king. Numbness rushed into Elara's fingertips, and the plastic tray slipped from her grasp. Ceramic mugs exploded against the linoleum, sending jagged shards sliding across the floor in the dead silence. Those golden eyes locked onto hers. Ignoring the terrified patrons and the shattered cups, he stepped deeper into the room, his boot heels crunching rhythmically over the broken ceramic. He didn't spare a glance for the owner, tracking purely onto Elara as he crossed the diner in 4 long strides. Heat rolled off his chest as he stopped just inches away, completely trapping her against the counter. A calloused finger hooked under her chin, forcing her to look up into his predatory stare. "Found you," he murmured, the low rumble vibrating straight through her ribs. The world tilted on its axis, locking the cage door on the invisible life she had fought so hard to build. "Found you," he murmured. The low vibration of his voice rattled the cheap silverware on the counter. Oxygen drained completely from the room, leaving nothing but the suffocating heat of his chest pressing against her apron. Before she could map an escape route, his calloused hand clamped around her waist. The grip burned straight through the grease-stained cotton, branding her skin with absolute possession. Behind the counter, the owner sputtered a pathetic objection. A lethal rumble vibrated through the king's ribs. He didn't even turn his head. He simply tossed a velvet bag onto the floorboards. Gold coins spilled out, clinking sharply against the broken ceramic, buying her life in blood money. Then he hoisted her over his shoulder. Instead of freezing, survival instincts hijacked her brain. She drove her elbows down, burying her knuckles into the thick muscle of his back. "Put me down!" she screamed, the sound tearing her throat raw. His boots kept their brutal, rhythmic pace. His palm anchored the back of her thighs, locking her against his side with terrifying ease. Ripping the broken diner doors completely off their hinges, they plunged into the freezing storm. Rain slashed across Elara's face, biting her cheeks. The paralyzing dark of the night her pack died threatened to drown her all over again. Baring her teeth, she kicked wildly, aiming her boots at his knees. He absorbed the blows without flinching and shoved her into the rear seat of an armored SUV idling at the curb. The steel door slammed shut, cutting off the storm entirely. Total darkness devoured her. The engine roared to life, dragging the reinforced frame away from the only sanctuary she had ever managed to scrape together. Inside the lightless cabin, the suffocating stench of wet asphalt vanished, replaced entirely by dark spices, pine needles, and the lethal scent of an apex predator. Her inner wolf slammed against her ribs, desperate to expose its throat. Fighting the intoxicating pull, Elara scrambled backward until her spine hit the reinforced window. The leather offered zero barrier against the man occupying the opposite seat. Shadows shifted as he leaned forward. Golden eyes tracked the frantic rise of her collarbone. Raising trembling fingers, she curled them into defensive claws. "Don't touch me!" He froze instantly. The terrifying predator went entirely rigid, reading the unadulterated terror radiating off her skin. The hum of the tires against wet asphalt filled the tight space. She forced herself to swallow the metallic taste of adrenaline pooling under her tongue before taking another breath. As the silence stretched, he tilted his head. He pulled a slow, deliberate drag of air through his teeth. His scarred features twisted into a furious scowl. "Poison," he rumbled, the word vibrating with lethal anger. "You smell like chemical poison." "Why?" She locked her jaw. Confessing meant execution. Before she could calculate a lie, a violent cramp ripped through her stomach. Withdrawal. Folding in half, she dug her nails into her knees and gasped through the agonizing spike of pain. Leather creaked. He reached for her. "Don't!" she choked out, thrashing away from his outstretched fingers. The rejection fractured his iron control. "I am not going to hurt you," he commanded, his voice a low, lethal whisper. The lie echoed the exact promises Vance's enforcers used right before dragging girls to the cages. She squeezed her eyes shut, riding out the nauseating wave of withdrawal while the vehicle slowed to a smooth halt. Through the tinted glass, iron gates parted like a steel jaw, welcoming her into a fortress of dark stone. Escape was completely impossible. Dragged deep into the stone fortress, he shoved her firmly into a sprawling room overlooking the city. The oak door clicked shut behind her, driving home the lethal reality of her new cage. Panic spiked hot and sharp behind her eyes. Confinement instantly resurrected the copper stench of her family's slaughtered bodies. Forcing the phantom smell away, she dug her shaking fingers into the seam of her dirty apron. She extracted a crushed, white pill, her absolute last line of defense. Tossing it back, she swallowed the chalky powder dry. It burned a corrosive trail down her throat, offering a sick, painful comfort. By tomorrow, the cage would break, and the true royal scent would spill out. Static popped through a hidden speaker above her head. "I know you are terrified." His rough voice bled out into the empty room. Elara planted her boots on the carpet, tilting her chin up toward the ceiling. "Let me go." "I can't do that." "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, refusing to let her voice crack. She backed away until she hit the cold glass wall, refusing to break his gaze even through the ceiling. "You saved me." The raw confession filtered through the electronic fuzz. No one else ever looked at a monster bleeding in an alley and offered them pure mercy. The speaker cut out. The hum of the central heating rushed into the quiet, wrapping around her rigid shoulders. She stared at her scuffed boots, remembering the feral beast she had offered her last meal. "I won't touch you," the speaker crackled again. "Not until you willingly come to me." A metallic click echoed through the room. The deadbolt disengaged. She flinched, scrambling backward against the glass, waiting for him to rip the door open. The wood cracked open just a few inches. A silver tray slid across the floorboards, stopping right on the edge of the plush carpet. The door snapped shut, and the lock slammed back into place. Steam curled off a perfectly roasted steak, carrying the rich scent of seared meat and butter directly to her starving stomach. Acid roiled in her empty gut. He fed her. Crawling slowly toward the warm tray, she stared at the meat, realizing the most dangerous thing in this fortress wasn't his teeth, it was his patience. Morning light bled through the floor-to-ceiling glass, illuminating the scraped silver tray from last night's meal. Pushing herself up off the mattress, Elara let the silk sheets slip down her bruised arms. The slick material felt alien against her skin, a sharp contrast to the rough cotton she usually wore. Rubbing the grit from her eyes, she dropped her bare feet to the carpet. Survival instincts demanded immediate action. Tracing the perimeter of the room, she logged the blind spots near the oak door and counted the dark security lenses mounted in the ceiling plaster. Victims of slaughtered packs didn't survive by waiting for a monster to decide their fate. Twisting the brass doorknob, she found the deadbolt disengaged. The hall stretched out in both directions, paved with dark hardwood polished to a lethal shine. Ancient iron blades lined the plaster walls. Standing near the sweeping staircase, 2 female guards occupied the space. Bulging muscles strained against their dark tactical gear. Catching sight of Elara's wrinkled uniform, the taller warrior curled her lip. "Look at the weak little human," she sneered, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The king picked up a filthy stray from the garbage. "She probably carries diseases." Starved of suppressants, the caged beast inside Elara's ribs slammed against her sternum. Rage flooded her veins, burning hot and fast. A memory of her gentle mother, mocked by larger wolves right before snow-stained red, flashed behind her eyes. Today, she refused to bite her tongue. Closing the distance to a side table, she locked her fingers around a crystal glass. She squeezed. The thick crystal ruptured entirely under her bare palm. Jagged shards rained onto the hardwood. The sharp clatter echoed down the corridor, followed instantly by a ringing silence. Dust motes drifted through the morning light as the 2 warriors flinched back, utterly stunned. Dropping the jagged stem, Elara offered them nothing but dead, hollow eyes. She didn't bleed. She didn't flinch. Pivoting on her heel, she walked right back into her room, closing the door on the shocked wolves. The real terror wasn't being trapped in a fortress of killers. It was the violent power waking up inside her blood. Retreating from the hallway, Elara bypassed the bedroom and stepped directly into the expansive closet. Sunlight caught the diamond jewelry and soft cashmere lining the walls, illuminating racks of silk gowns with the tags still attached. Everything was tailored exactly to her size. The bedroom door clicked open. Kalen crossed the threshold, his tailored suit struggling to contain the coiled muscle of his shoulders. He sucked all the oxygen straight out of the room. "Wear the red one tonight," he commanded softly, stopping at the edge of the closet. "It will suit you." Her lungs seized. Snatching the crimson silk from its hanger, she balled the expensive fabric in her fists and hurled it straight at his chest. "I am not your little doll," she screamed, the sound tearing her throat raw. The red silk fluttered to the carpet. The hum of the central heating rushed into the quiet, wrapping around the ringing in her ears. Elara braced herself, fully expecting a brutal strike for the blatant disrespect. Instead of raising a hand, he simply stared at the crumpled dress. then lifted his glowing eyes to meet hers. Pure, infuriating respect radiated from his posture. "I don't want your money," she choked out, digging her nails into her forearms. "I want my own clothes. I want my own life. I want you to stop looking at me like a prize. You demand basic respect, not royal worship," he stated softly, acknowledging her fury without an ounce of pity. Before the fragile understanding could take root, a frantic knock shattered the quiet. A pale guard leaned into the room. "Sire, Alpha Vance is here. He is demanding a preliminary audience before the gala." Ice water replaced the blood in Elara's veins. The local alpha who ran the breeding camps was standing inside the compound walls. She had to walk downstairs and face the butcher who slaughtered her family. The long walk down the grand staircase felt like marching to a firing squad. By the time Elara crossed the threshold into the meeting room, the final remnants of the suppressant were completely gone. Boiling acid pumped through her heart, turning her vision black at the edges as the bright chandelier streaked across her retinas. Sitting back in a leather chair across the glass table, Alpha Vance offered a cruel, smug smile. A rotting stench hit her nose, entirely overriding the polished wood and clean linen of the room. It was the scent of decaying pine and old blood, the exact smell that hung in the forest the night her pack died. He had given the order. Slipping her hands under the table, she dug her nails into her palms until wet copper pooled under her skin. Leaning forward, Vance dragged a deliberate breath of air through his teeth. "Your new human pet looks a bit pale, King Kalen. Are you sure she isn't diseased?" The wood groaned under Kalen's boots as he stood up abruptly. A dictatorial aura exploded outward, vibrating the glass tabletop and rattling the crystal pitchers. He planted himself directly in front of Elara, a wall of coiled muscle shielding her completely from the rival alpha. Vance choked on his own oxygen, shrinking back into his chair. The low hum of the compound's generator vibrated through the floorboards. Neither alpha moved. Behind her protector, Elara's body gave out. Sour copper flooded the back of her throat. Shoving her chair back with a violent screech, she bolted. She sprinted blindly down the corridor, throwing her weight against the bathroom door and slamming the deadbolt home. Gripping the marble sink, she stared at her stark white knuckles, her chest convulsed. She coughed, splattering bright crimson blood across the white porcelain. In the dead silence of the bathroom, an intoxicating, sweet floral scent bloomed. The chemical cage was gone. Her royal Omega bloodline was screaming its identity into the air, and there was nowhere left to hide. Hours after coughing blood into the porcelain sink, the stone compound finally settled into a deceptive quiet. Slipping out of the bathroom, Elara hugged the dark corridor, dragging her boots across the polished hardwood toward the medical wing. The chemical cage was gone, leaving an agonizing ache in her chest that demanded an immediate substitute before the gala. Pushing through the swinging doors, the harsh bite of rubbing alcohol and bleached cotton stung her nose. Moonlight sliced through the blinds, illuminating the glass cabinets as she violently yanked the handles open. Her fingers scrambled over plastic packaging, hunting for synthetic adrenaline, anything to mute the royal bloodline screaming in her veins. Wrapping her knuckles around a plastic syringe, she prepared to drive the needle into her thigh. A shadow blotted out the moonlight. In the sudden dark, the refrigerator compressor kicked on with a low hum. Boot heels clicked a lethal rhythm against the tile as Kalen crossed the threshold. Reaching out, he effortlessly plucked the syringe from her shaking grip and tossed it into a steel basin. The plastic rattled sharply against the metal. Pure survival instinct forced Elara to bolt. Throwing her weight forward, she tried to shove past his chest. His arm snapped out, hooking her waist and pinning her spine flush against the freezing counter. The temperature in the room spiked. "Let me go!" she demanded, fighting the urge to claw at his suit. "You are hiding something," he growled, the vibration rumbling directly into her sternum. Pinning her in place, his golden eyes dropped to her mouth. Gravity seemed to warp, pulling her toward the exact predator she needed to escape. Heat bloomed under her collarbone. Refusing to break eye contact, she tilted her chin up. I am just trying to survive. He leaned closer, dragging a slow breath across her cheek, stripping the aggression from his posture. A dark focus settled over his scarred features. Calloused fingers traced the line of her jaw. You are coming to the royal gala tonight. By my side. I will not let you out of my sight. It was a death sentence wrapped in velvet, guaranteeing that by midnight, hundreds of apex predators would realize exactly what was standing right in front of them. Dragged directly from the quiet infirmary into the glaring light, the grand ballroom assaulted her senses. The air tasted thick with expensive perfumes, roasted meats, and the territorial aggression of 100 warring packs. Trapped in the crimson gown, Elara stood rigidly beside the towering king. Boiling acid pumped through her heart. Smiling at passing nobles required locking her jaw and swallowing the metallic taste pooling under her tongue. Across the crowded floor, Alpha Vance tracked her every move, an arrogant sneer carving deep lines into his face. A scarred palm settled onto the curve of her spine. Kaelin steered her onto the polished floor, pulling her flush against the rigid line of his suit. As they stepped into the rhythm of the string quartet, the final microscopic barrier in her bloodstream ruptured. Her royal scent erupted into the room. Rolling out like a shockwave, the undeniable aroma of crushed winter roses and dark soil saturated the air. The cello screeched to a halt. Violin bows froze in midair. Without warning, the clinking of champagne glasses vanished entirely. Hundreds of dancing wolves stopped moving, snapping their heads toward the center of the room. Kaelin's grip tightened into iron. Pulling her completely against his chest, a blinding light flared in his golden eyes. He bared elongated fangs at the glittering crowd, daring a single soul to step forward. Shattering the stillness, Vance threw his head back. A deafening howl ripped from his throat, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The signal was absolute, dropping assassins from the balcony shadows and plunging the fragile piece into immediate slaughter. Before the first assassin even hit the floorboards, Kaelin shoved Elara behind him. With the volume of a gunshot, bone cracked. His tailored suit ruptured entirely. Silver fur erupted from his tearing skin as his spine lengthened, transforming the civilized king into a towering lichen right in front of her eyes. A monstrous roar vibrated the crystal chandeliers above. Lunging forward, he became a blur of fangs and lethal violence. He snatched the closest attacker by the throat, hoisting the man completely off his feet before launching him across the ballroom. Hitting a marble pillar, the body collapsed with a sickening crunch. Red spray painted the polished wood. Chaos consumed the crowd, but Elara planted her boots firmly on the ground. She didn't run. Watching the beast shred flesh to protect her, the terrified waitress vanished, leaving only a dark awe. The ultimate nightmare was standing between her and death. Clashing against iron claws, steel blades rang out across the hall. Screams drowned out the classical music as more assassins flooded the floor, revealing Vance's true plan to seize the throne. Outnumbered and surrounded by crossing blades, the Lycan snapped his jaws, locking his glowing eyes on the perimeter. Spinning away from the carnage, the beast scooped Elara into his blood-soaked arms. The monstrous grip offered a devastating gentleness against her bruised ribs. Locking her arms around his thick neck, she buried her face in his fur. Muscles coiled as he sprinted toward the perimeter of the room. He didn't slow down. Hitting the edge of the floor, the Lycan launched them both directly at the towering windows. Glass exploded into 1,000 glittering shards as the cold air swallowed them whole, sending them plummeting into the dark abyss. The bitter city wind swallowed them as their boots slammed against the rusted metal of a fire escape. Freezing rain immediately plastered the ruined red silk to Elara's skin, sending violent shivers down her spine. The iron grating groaned under Kaelin's weight. Dark blood poured freely from the deep sword gashes crossing his Lycan ribs, forcing his steps to falter. The savage king was bleeding out. Driving a heavy boot into the rotting wood, he kicked the door of an abandoned safe house off its hinges. The immediate stench of damp concrete and metallic blood completely erased the scent of the storm. Kaelin collapsed onto the dirty floorboards. Bones snapped and popped in the pitch black. Elara watched his broad shoulders violently heave as the silver-tipped fur receded, leaving his human skin bare and slick with gore. Dropping to her knees on the filthy wood, her mind flashed back to a dark cave. She remembered watching her mother lick the deep gashes on her father's chest after a border skirmish, proving that a pack's true strength lived in the healing, not the bite. Reaching out, she pressed her freezing palms against his torn chest. Fever radiated from his skin, burning her fingertips. He flinched, dragging a ragged breath over his teeth. "Don't. I am covered in filth." Ignoring the warning, she crawled closer. Her dormant Omega instincts surged forward, drowning out the terrified waitress who had spent years scrubbing diner floors. The most lethal predator in the city was kneeling in the dirt, completely at her mercy. "Let me help you," she whispered. Surrendering the final shreds of her chemical cage, a wave of sweet winter roses rushed into the stagnant air. The undeniable scent acted as a biological anchor, directly answering the violent trauma in his blood. Moonlight sliced through the broken window pane, catching a single drop of moisture tracking down his scarred cheek. This monster, forged entirely in brutality, looked at her as if she were the only sacred object left in the ruin of his life. He let his head fall forward until his forehead rested heavily against her collarbone. She wiped the blood from his chest. Tracing the jagged lines of his scars, she accepted the violent reality of the bond. Lifting his chin, his golden eyes darkened, completely consumed by raw hunger. His mouth crashed down onto hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a bruising theft. His calloused hands locked around her waist, dragging her flush against his burning chest. He tasted like hot copper, freezing rain, and absolute devotion. Heat flared in her stomach as she opened her mouth to him, sealing the mate bond in the dark. There was no turning back. A violent shockwave ruptured behind Elara's eyes. The physical world vanished, replaced entirely by a sprawling, psychic map snapping into focus inside her skull. She felt the vibration of thousands of wolves. Their fierce loyalty, their spiking rage, and their unyielding devotion rushed into her mind like a flood. The kiss hadn't just claimed Kaelin. It had wired her directly into the Royal Pack network. She was the Luna, breaking the kiss. She gasped for air. "You feel them?" Kaelin rumbled, the vibration traveling from his mouth straight into her lips. "I feel everything." Static violently crackled from a tactical radio abandoned on a dusty crate. "Alpha!" A frantic voice screamed through the speaker, cutting right through the quiet intimacy. "Vance has breached the main gates. We are under siege." The temperature in the safe house plummeted. Kaelin's golden eyes flared bright, incinerating the vulnerable man from seconds before. The dictatorial king reemerged, calculating the exact logistics of the coup Vance had launched on the compound. A low snarl ripped through Elara's throat. She wasn't running anymore. Standing up in the shadows, Kaelin's muscles coiled tight as he pulled dark tactical pants from a hidden stash box. He didn't order her to stay behind. He didn't treat her like a fragile liability. Closing the distance between them, he pressed a long, jagged hunting blade directly into her palm. The cold steel felt perfectly balanced in her grip. "We are going home," he stated simply. Power spiked in her veins, fueled by his absolute trust in her survival instincts. She tightened her grip on the hilt and followed his broad back out the rotting door. Stepping back into the storm, a single dark thought clawed at her mind. Vance was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. What kind of weapon gave him the confidence to siege a Lycan King's fortress? Burning rubber and sulfur choked the air blocks before they even reached the compound. The iron gates of the fortress were blown completely off their hinges, leaving a jagged, smoking crater in the asphalt. 5 rogue wolves exploded from the dark alleyway, cutting off their path. Thick saliva dripped from their bared fangs. Adrenaline dumped into Elara's bloodstream. Before Kaelin could step in front of her, she pushed past his shoulder and planted her boots firmly in the center of the wet street. Tapping into the ancient well of power she had suppressed for years, she dragged a deep breath of smoke into her lungs. She slammed her Royal Omega aura directly outward. The invisible pressure rolled over the asphalt like a concrete wall. All 5 rogues collapsed simultaneously. Their jaws hit the wet street with a sickening crack. Whining pathetically, instinct forced them to expose their throats, instantly submitting to the crushing weight of her bloodline. Glancing sideways, Kaelin stared at her in pure, unrestrained awe. A sharp, metallic crack echoed from the rooftop above. There was no warning. A silver-laced dart buried itself deep into Kaelin's trapezius. He threw his head back, ripping a deafening roar of absolute agony from his throat. The projectile wasn't just coated in silver. A sickly green fluid pumped from the clear chamber directly into his bloodstream. His knees buckled. A mountain of muscle collapsed, hitting the bloody concrete with a wet thud. "No!" Elara screamed, dropping the blade and sliding across the rough asphalt to reach his side. A mocking laugh drifted out from the smoky shadows near the ruined gates. Alpha Vance strolled into the flickering streetlight, lazily twirling a customized rifle. "Experimental neurotoxin," Vance sneered, driving the toe of his boot hard into Kaelin's limp ribs. "It eats Lycan beasts from the inside out." Racking the bolt of the rifle, Vance aimed the heavy barrel directly at the center of Elara's forehead. Gunpowder and burnt copper choked the freezing rain. Alpha Vance casually lowered the smoking barrel of his customized rifle, a nasty chuckle rattling in his throat. "Human science is a beautiful thing," Vance sneered, kicking the empty green casing across the asphalt. "They make wonderful toys to kill monsters." Green toxin aggressively burned through Kaelin's cellular structure, turning the veins along his neck a rotting black. The Lycan King crashed onto the wet concrete, his glowing eyes fading into a dull, terrifying yellow. Survival instincts overrode the ringing in Elara's ears. Ignoring the taunts of the rival Alpha, she dropped to the wet pavement and locked her raw fingers around Kaelin's leather collar. She planted her boots on the rough street, using every ounce of leverage to drag his dead weight toward the shadows. The distant, baying howl of tracking hounds echoed off the brick buildings. Vance was calling in the pack. Scanning the dark alleyway, Elara spotted a rusted grate covering an abandoned subway tunnel. She remembered hiding in muddy ditches while her father drew trackers away, knowing exactly how to vanish into the dirt. Hooking her boots under the metal lip, she shoved backward, dragging the grate away from the gaping hole. She kicked Kaelin's unmoving legs toward the concrete stairs, letting gravity drag him down into the pitch-black void. Tumbling over the ledge right behind him, she reached up and slammed the iron grate shut, plunging them into a cold, wet tomb. Gravity deposited them harshly at the bottom of the concrete stairwell, slamming Elara's shoulder against a cold brick wall. Stagnant water and rotting garbage completely overpowered the scent of rain. Gasping for oxygen, she dragged herself across the damp floor and pulled Kaelin's head onto her lap. Deep claw marks scarred the concrete surrounding them, a chilling reminder of the monsters that lurked in the dark. Years of swallowing toxic suppressants had ruined her physical stamina, leaving her muscles shaking violently as she pressed her palms against his ruined chest. She pushed her floral aura directly into his nose, desperate to wake his dormant beast. The Lycan's chest barely moved. Frost touched his pale skin. A wet wheeze escaped his lips as his golden eyes dulled into a flat amber. Lifting a bloody finger, Kaelin weakly shoved her healing hands away. "Run," he choked out, grinding the word through a mouthful of black blood. "Leave me. Run." If he died on this freezing floor, the severed mate bond would stop her heart right next to his. "I am not leaving you," she demanded, her voice cracking as she tightened her grip on his freezing wrist. In the echoing dark, The frantic barking of hounds morphed from a distant threat into a close, enclosed echo. The dogs were inside the tunnel. Blinding beams of light suddenly cut through the pitch black, searing Elara's retinas. Scraping her boots against the floor, she backed up until her spine hit solid brick. It was a dead end. Trapped against the brick wall, Elara squinted through the blinding flashlight beams as boots splashed into the stagnant puddles. Alpha Vance stepped into the harsh glare, flanked by a dozen snarling enforcers. Well, Vance chuckled, the dark sound bouncing off the curved ceiling. The garbage stray and her dead king. Lowering his customized rifle, Vance pulled a silver chain from his tactical vest. The metal clinked sharply in the damp space. "Don't worry, little Omega," Vance smirked. "I won't kill you. My breeding camps always need royal blood. You'll give me very strong pups." For years, she had swallowed poison and scrubbed floors, entirely convinced she was a pathetic victim. The illusion died the moment Vance threatened the mate bleeding out behind her. Planting her boots in the freezing mud, Elara stepped directly over Kalen's unconscious body. "You will not touch him," she stated. "Or what?" Vance mocked, taking a deliberate step forward. Instead of answering, Elara tilted her head back toward the leaky ceiling. Tapping into the suppressed power of the lost bloodline, she ripped a soul-shattering howl straight from her lungs. It wasn't a desperate plea for mercy. It was an absolute command from a true Luna, demanding blood. The raw sonic force cracked the glass lenses of the enforcers' flashlights. The pitch of the howl traveled up the stairwell, echoing through the iron grate and vibrating the city streets above to summon the loyal pack. Dust showered down from the ceiling as the entire concrete tunnel began to violently shake. Concrete dust showered down from the curved ceiling. Before Elara could blink the grit from her eyes, the iron grates high above the stairwell exploded inward. The ancient command of the lost bloodline flooded the city grid, dragging loyal wolves straight down through the gaping holes to protect their new Luna. They crashed into the stagnant puddles like artillery shells, fangs locked with fangs, claws ripped through tactical vests as the newly arrived enforcers immediately launched themselves into Alpha Vance's strike force. Blood painted the brick walls, slick and hot. Refusing to cower from the slaughter unfolding inches from her face, Elara dropped her knees into the freezing mud. She clamped her shaking palms directly over Kalen's unmoving sternum. The mate bond functioned as a live wire, linking their nervous systems. She visualized the raw, burning energy of her Omega bloodline and drove it directly into his failing heart. Heat blistered her fingertips. A thermal shockwave rippled through his coiled muscles. The rotting black veins snaking up his throat instantly receded, flushing back to a healthy blue. She tracked the erratic flutter of his pulse as it smoothed into a steady, brutal rhythm. Dark steam began rolling off his damp skin, literally sweating the poison out of his pores. Across the tunnel, Vance's men screamed as the loyalists shredded their lines. Realizing his absolute failure, the rival Alpha spun on his heel and sprinted back down the pitch-black corridor like a coward. The mud vibrated violently beneath Elara's knees. Kalen's golden eyes snapped open, burning with atomic intensity. He didn't blink. He didn't groan. He woke up entirely vicious, fueled by the ancient power she had just pumped into his veins. Rising slowly from the dirt, the Lycan towered over her, his stare burning with an obsession that curled her toes inside her ruined boots. He reached down, threading his blood-slick fingers securely through hers. It was time to hunt. An hour later, the torrential rain stripped the subway mud from their skin as they rallied inside an abandoned meatpacking warehouse. The stagnant air tasted of wet fur, gun oil, and the jagged edge of raw adrenaline. 30 hardened warriors formed a tight circle around a rusted metal barrel, their boots scraping against the concrete. As Elara stepped into the flickering light of a bare bulb, every single killer dipped their chin in absolute respect. Accepting the invisible weight of the crown, she snapped a piece of chalk and smoothed a torn city map over the rusted iron. She traced the memory of her father teaching her how to hunt in a blizzard. The deadliest trap was never the open field, but the familiar hallway where the prey felt secure. Pressing the chalk into the paper, she slashed a hard line across the grid. "Vance holds the main gates," she stated, projecting her voice to bounce off the corrugated metal walls. She tapped a narrow alleyway near the edge of the map. "We don't hit the front. We take the old servant tunnels running under the kitchen." Years of scrubbing floors and hiding in blind spots had mapped the compound better than any architectural blueprint. She dragged the chalk across the weak entry points, highlighting the choke points and dictating the assault to a room of seasoned killers with dictatorial ease. Still, a jagged thought caught in her mind. Someone inside the compound had disabled the biometric grid to let Vance in. A traitor was breathing the exact same air as the throne. The scratching of the chalk stopped. The quiet stretched. Lifting her chin, Elara found Kalen staring at her from across the barrel. He hadn't interrupted. He hadn't stepped in to assert dominance. With his scarred arms crossed over his bare chest, the king simply watched her command his army, radiating unapologetic pride. The final wall around her heart shattered completely. He offered a single, sharp nod. "You heard the Luna," Kalen rumbled, the vibration rattling the loose tin roof. "Load your weapons and follow her lead." Shotguns racked, echoing through the warehouse as silver blades slid into leather sheaths. Approaching the smoking perimeter of the compound, the storm lashed the broken iron gates with renewed violence. Lightning strobed across the sky, illuminating dozens of Vance's rogue wolves stationed along the high stone walls. Sniper rifles and heavy crossbows tracked the flooded street. The sheer number of enemies forced a hard swallow down Elara's throat. She didn't break stride. Stepping directly into the center of the rain-slicked asphalt, she completely abandoned the shadows. Tapping into her royal aura, she didn't just leak her scent, she weaponized it. She shoved the suffocating weight of the ancient bloodline forward, using it as an invisible battering ram against the perimeter. Rifles clattered onto the stone walls. Crossbows misfired into the sky. The rogues collapsed to their knees, violently clutching their skulls. The crushing biological demand of the true Luna fractured their willpower, breaking their lines without a single blade being drawn. Kalen matched her pace, walking shoulder to shoulder through the deluge. The Lycan was a coiled spring of lethal efficiency. When a foolish rogue stumbled off the wall, attempting to block their path, Kalen casually snapped the man's neck and tossed the body aside. The assault was a perfectly synchronized execution. Elara's aura paralyzed the front line, and the king cleared the remaining debris. They marched through the smoking courtyard, their boots crunching over shattered glass and burning debris. The remaining enemy forces broke rank, abandoning the fortress and scattering into the dark woods rather than facing the queen and her monster. Stopping at the top of the marble steps, they faced the towering oak doors of the grand throne room. Anticipation hummed in the tight space between them. Elara tilted her head toward Kalen. He met her gaze, flashing elongated fangs in a wicked, predatory grin. Driving his heavy boot forward, Kalen kicked the thick wooden doors entirely off their brass hinges. Oak doors exploded inward, launching jagged splinters across the polished stone. Plaster dust choked the air. Shoving his remaining guards directly into the crossfire, Alpha Vance scrambled backward, wedging his cowardly frame behind the granite throne. Kalen didn't hesitate. Becoming a blur of silver fur and absolute ruin, the Lycan tore through the front line. Bone snapped loudly over the ringing in Elara's ears. Stepping out from the shadow of a marble pillar, a tall figure raised a silver-loaded pistol. It was the female guard from the staircase, tracking the weapon directly toward Kalen's blind spine. The metallic click of the hammer cocking sliced through the chaos. Elara didn't scream a useless warning. Tapping into the boiling power of her bloodline, she shoved a crushing wave of Royal Omega command straight into the traitor's skull. Dropping the pistol, the guard collapsed. She clawed at her own temples, screaming in blinding agony. Ignoring the shrieking traitor, Kalen cleared the final steps to the throne. his blood-soaked claws locked around Vance's throat. A wet tear ripped through the room. The tyrant's vocal cords severed entirely. Ripping the rival alpha's throat out, Kaelin tossed the ruined flesh aside. The body hit the stone with a sickening thud. Blood pooled rapidly across the floor, leaving the room with absolutely nothing left to kill. The metallic tang of fresh slaughter coated the back of Elara's throat. Adrenaline drained rapidly from her veins, leaving her knees trembling as the deafening echo of combat faded into a stagnant quiet. Slipping in the wet gore, Kaelin dropped hard to his scarred knees. Bone cracked and popped as the silver-tipped fur receded into exhausted skin. Steam rolled off his broad shoulders. Staring at the butchered corpse of his enemy, his chest heaved with ragged breaths. Closing the distance, Elara sank into the pooling blood right beside him. She remembered holding a wounded bird as a child, waiting for the frantic heartbeat to slow against her palms. Wrapping her arms securely around his neck, she anchored his violent soul. He broke, burying his filthy face into the curve of her stomach. A jagged sob ripped out of the king's chest. She threaded her fingers through his dark hair, wiping the grime from his jaw while the adrenaline finally stopped ringing in her ears. The scrape of boots against stone broke the stillness. Loyal enforcers crept out from the corridor, taking one look at the carnage before dropping to the floor. They bowed their heads entirely, submitting to their undisputed Luna. Rising slowly, Kaelin scooped her directly into his arms, carrying her away from the graveyard to claim their sanctuary. Hours later, the copper stench of the throne room washed away, replaced by the scent of dark pine and crushed roses drifting through the shattered window. Moonlight sliced across the tiled floor. Sitting on the edge of the porcelain tub, Elara watched Kaelin dip a white cloth into warm water. He dragged the damp fabric gently down her collarbone, methodically wiping the dried blood from her pale skin. Despite his lethal strength, the calloused fingers tracing her ribs felt completely reverent. A low hum vibrated from the central heating, wrapping around the quiet intensity of the room. Lifting her chin, she met his golden eyes. The predatory violence from the throne room was gone, replaced entirely by a starving devotion. Leaning forward, his mouth brushed hers. It wasn't the bruising theft of the alleyway. The kiss delivered a slow, sweeping promise of absolute ruin and perfect safety. Her inner wolf purred, scraping against her ribs. Tilting her head back, she exposed the pulse jumping frantically at the base of her throat. She surrendered her final defense, offering the king the ultimate claim. A low growl vibrated through his chest. His fangs pierced her skin. The piercing sting instantly dissolved into a rush of liquid gold pouring straight into her bloodstream. The ancient bond snapped permanently into place, fusing their fractured souls. The war was finally over, leaving the monsters entirely alone in the dark. 6 months of rebuilding had stripped the metallic scent of blood from the city, replacing it with the sharp bite of roasted coffee and imported cigars. Sitting at the head of a mahogany table, Elara ran her thumb along the edge of a thick ledger. The back room of the rusted diner, the exact place she used to scrub on her hands and knees, now operated as the syndicate headquarters for the ruling pack. She didn't swallow chalky poison anymore. Her true aura spilled freely into the cramped space, lacing the recycled air with winter roses. Adjusting the lapel of her tailored suit, she let the gold chain rest flat against her collarbone. Through the dirty window, the freezing alley where she once begged for scraps looked like a faded nightmare. Today, she held the executioner's blade. Flipping the paper page, she dragged a black pen down the column of numbers. Hardened killers took her orders without a single flinch. Tracing the ink, she managed the territory with a quiet, iron grip. Boot heels scuffed the linoleum in the hallway. The low hum of the refrigerator compressor vibrated through the floorboards. Glancing up from the paperwork, she found Kaelin blocking the doorway. His dark shirt stretched taut over his folded arms, trapping the apex predator in a calm stance. Pale scars lined his jaw, framing a faint, predatory curve on his mouth. He watched her work with an absolute, consuming obsession. Closing the ledger, Elara leaned back into her leather chair. The wood creaked loudly in the silent room. Pushing off the doorframe, the king crossed the linoleum in 3 fluid strides. Calloused fingers brushed the loose hair from her neck, sending a spike of heat directly into her pulse point. He leaned down, pressing his teeth gently against her scarred skin, inhaling the scent of his reigning Luna. "Mine," he murmured, the low vibration rattling straight through her ribs. A dark, lethal promise, reminding the city exactly who owned the shadows now.